So I know that we've discussed this topic before. How do you know whether or not you're on the path to awakening? And really it all comes down to this. That is, whether or not one is following the worldly path or the transcendent path. Because the transcendent path is the path that leads to the supermundane, that transcends the world. And this is what we call awakening. An important point to bear in mind is that for nearly all of us, we are on the mundane or the worldly path. And it's more by necessity than it is by choice. Because when it comes down to it, we have no choice but to live in the world. We need to live in the world and we need to get by. And because of that, we cannot abandon the worldly path. So are you able to pursue the transcendent path and the worldly path in parallel or together? Well, whether or not this is possible is not really the point. The point is, we have no other choice. Really what we have to do is, we just get on with our worldly lives and do our best to do whatever we can to pursue the spiritual life. But that's not easy. And it's not easy for lay people, but it's also not easy for monastics. Just because people live in monasteries in the Himalayan mountains doesn't mean that they're any better off in this regard. It's because it's so difficult. The monks and nuns living in the monasteries in Nepal, they need to eat. They need clothing. They need somewhere to sleep. And the monasteries are busy places. There's lots of worldly work to do. They're better off than us in many ways. And that's because their entire life is geared towards the Dharma, even the worldly aspects. And what I mean by that is, when they're finding the means to buy food and sustain the community, they're doing so in a kind of Dharma way. It's what's called white samsara. And so the influence of the environment has a strong effect on one's own conduct. I mean, when everybody around you is studying scriptures, meditating, doing prostrations, that sort of thing, then it's difficult for you yourself to carry on with a completely worldly life. But sadly, many people in monasteries are very worldly minded. I would say there's a stark contrast between the monasteries in India and Nepal and the ones in Tibet. And it has to do with this point. Based on the general conduct of the community, then your conduct is either acceptable or not acceptable. It's something that people will frown on or they will accept. And so when everybody's doing the same thing, it's kind of easy to follow along in that way. And this is something that's really apparent to me. This is now my second year of being out of retreat and back in the West. And I can say with great certainty that I'm much less of a spiritual practitioner now than I was when I was in retreat. And that has a lot to do with environment. Because everything around me, everybody I'm associated with, is engaged solely in the mundane or worldly path. They're preoccupied by their worldly activities. And so there's little scope or context for someone like me to exist in a purely spiritual context here in the West. I mean, in many ways, I'm quite surprised that I'm still in robes, that I'm not a layperson. Because wherever I go, I don't see other monks and nuns. And most people consider me to be something of an oddity. I got a lot of odd looks from people, even when they're not necessarily averse to religion or spirituality. It's just kind of shocking to see somebody walking up to you dressed in odd clothing. The funny thing is, most people think I'm a Hare Krishna. They really don't know the difference between a Buddhist monk and a Hare Krishna. But to be honest, there's a far greater difference between the Buddhist path and the Hare Krishna path than there is between Christianity and Islam. But we don't appreciate this. In fact, in many ways, Christianity is more similar to Hare Krishna than Buddhism is. And that's because, fundamentally, it's a theistic religion. Of course, within the Hindu traditions, they have this natural belief in karma, cause and effect, and rebirth. And that's not really present in modern Christianity. As I understand, then the early Christians did believe in rebirth, but that's something that was abandoned at a later time. Anyway, the point is, whatever your environment is, then that has a strong magnetizing effect. I think I've told you this before. When I first came from Nepal to Canada, and I saw my friend, who is a Khenpo, he's a monk, driving his car, it seemed quite odd to me. But now, I drive a car all the time, and I don't think twice about it. But it is strange to think about a monk owning or driving a car. In the monasteries, then the monks do drive motorcycles, and they do drive this little van for going shopping, but it's not something they personally own. In fact, the motorcycle is kind of communally owned. But I think I've mentioned this in previous occasions. These days, things are changing drastically. And that's because everybody has access to the world on their smartphones. And so the young monks see everything that's going on in the world. And they're kind of in awe of it, right? In fact, I'd say that they're more in awe of the advancements of the modern world than they are in the teachings of the Lord Buddha. Culturally, they feel like they have to have greater respect for the Buddha Dharma and the teachings that came and were passed down over thousands of years. But if you're realistic about it, then for most of the senior monks, they all rely on an iPhone or a smartphone. It's something that they can't do without. And it's difficult, right? Because we like to believe that the Lord Buddha was omniscient. But it seems that somebody from Silicon Valley in California was able to develop something that the Buddha wasn't able to develop. That's how it seems on the outside anyway. And this has a strong magnetizing effect. And so many of the young monks are influenced by this new culture. And also, in modern times, then many of our monks and nuns disrobe and go to the West. They go to the West seeking the promises of the modern world because they too want to own cars, have houses, go skiing, that sort of thing. Experience all the wonders of the modern world. And for the most part, many of them come from small villages in the mountains. And so, at a young age, when they came from the high Himalayan mountains to the monastery in Kathmandu, many of them haven't even seen a toilet, let alone a car. In fact, many of the people from the villages have seen buses. For example, they may have ridden on a bus in order to get to Kathmandu, but they hadn't seen actual cars before. So there was this story about he's now a senior monk, but when he was young, he came on a bus from a remote village into Kathmandu. And then he saw people driving around in cars, and he thought they were kind of toy versions of a bus. So he hadn't encountered these sort of things. My own Lama often tells the story about when he was young, and he went to Lhasa, and they had to hitchhike to get there. And they were so unfamiliar with cars and automobiles, they were afraid of them. They wanted to get a ride in this truck, but the driver wouldn't let them. So what they did is they waited until the truck pulled away, and then they went chasing after it. And he jumped on the back of the truck. But his friend was so afraid that he ran away, and so he had to get off again. But it just goes to show these strong differences in culture. And so for me, here in the West, I'm an anomaly. I'm an oddity, right? People see me to be some kind of eccentric and really wonder about my conduct, what I might be up to. And so it's uncomfortable being singled out in such an environment. But in the East, in the monasteries, for example, then everybody's wearing these clothes. One feels quite comfortable. And when lay people come to visit the monastery, they're the ones who feel out of place. They're not shocked in any way when they see a monk walking down the street with a mala in the hand and a prayer wheel. But when I come to the West and I act in this way, people think that I'm an eccentric. I'm doing something odd and strange. And they wonder what it's all about. It's all about context. And so this has got a lot to do with the difference between the mundane path and the transcendent path. It's all about outlook, mindset, and also motivation. And in the world, what we try to do is we try to make ourselves as comfortable as possible. And it's all about acquisitions, abundance, that sort of thing, position and wealth. None of these things matter on the spiritual path. When it comes to transcendence, it's about going beyond the world, going beyond these things. These are not seen to be important. And as we find in the famous text written by Lord Atisha called The Lamp on the Path to Awakening, there are taught to be 3 types of potential Dharma practitioner. That is, 3 types of people who are capable of following the spiritual path. The common aspect for these 3 types of individuals is that they have no concern for this life. They don't think about this life alone. They think about future lives and about progressing. And because of that, what they do is they dedicate themselves to virtue and have little concern for their well-being in the here and now, in this life. And by this, what we can see is nearly all of the modern spiritual teachers are teaching the worldly path and not the transcendent path. Because what they focus on is well-being in this life and not on transcendence. I know many of them claim to already be awakened, but it's quite clear from the way they conduct themselves and what they teach that they haven't even understood what awakening is. Their awakening is a mundane awakening. It's mere liberation from temporary unhappiness, the sort of unhappiness we experience through trauma and encountering difficulties in our worldly lives. And we know this because what they teach their students is how to manifest abundance, how to overcome worldly trauma, how to better oneself in the world, or to be happy with one's lot, that is, to be satisfied with what one has now. Now that's an important point on the spiritual path. Being content with what one has is an important point. It's something we need if we're going to be a spiritual practitioner. But in order to enter the supermundane or the transcendent path, one's goals necessarily have to extend beyond this life alone. But it's understandable, right? It's difficult for us to do. For one, we have no concrete evidence of an afterlife, of a life after this one, or that there is even something known as awakening or transcendence. So in this matter, or in this regard, then largely what we have to do is rely on faith. But when it comes to faith, then informed faith is far better than blind faith. Blind faith will help one to progress along the path, but at some point this needs to be abandoned. What we need to do is to develop a sincere and informed faith in the outcomes of spiritual practice and the potential of the spiritual path. And in order to do this, what we have to do is study. There's no other way. And it's even better if we can study with a teacher. It's very difficult for us to do this just by looking at books. But it's not a point that many people appreciate. And so my wish for you is that you should find a teacher, somebody who you have faith in and who you can rely on. And as a bare minimum, then that teacher needs 2 things. They have to have compassion, but also they should be learned in the Dharma. If you have faith, they have compassion, and on top of that, they actually have some knowledge, something to teach you, then that is a reliable recipe for making progress on the spiritual path. And it is my sincere wish that you should find happiness and well-being and progress swiftly on your spiritual journey to final awakening and freedom from suffering in the mundane world. So until next time, and see you later.